This is part 2 of making a fully bespoke Sebastian michaelis cosplay for myself. I am a thoroughly undertrained tailor, or at least a very close approximation, and I usually make sewing guides to get people started in bespoke tailoring. In part 1 of these 3, I made a tailcoat pattern out of a normal jacket pattern. Then I basted it together to try it on. So from here, I am making the alterations on the cloth and going over the important steps in making a tailcoat. Otherwise, I'll be glossing over the steps that overlap in making a normal jacket. This is almost exclusively a run-through of the technical aspects of making a tailcoat, and almost nothing to do with it being a cosplay. In the third part, I'll basically be going over dinner trousers and speeding through the waistcoat, as well as finally trying it on camera. Shortening the back, there are two ways to do so. Either raising the hem and balance points, which may be more difficult with a tailcoat. In this case, I just lower the back from the top, measuring 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch below the center back neck point, and shoulder point. I can use the pattern, so that makes it easy to draw it on. So at this moment, I can cut the inlay from the shoulder and trim the inlay off of the neck to just about 1 inch. Since there is a drop right, and both sides are asymmetrical, I have to do both sides separately instead of cutting them while they're on top of each other. Lastly, to show the new neckline, it gets stitch marked. I just use basting thread to do a running stitch along the new neckline. Oftentimes though, I'll use a red thread to make it much more clear. I add the linen down the back. The width of the linen needs to match the total width of the inlay going down and only a little bit at least above the brick tack at the hem of the back. At least a little below the waist though. It doesn't need to go all the way down to the raw edge, but at least past the hem onto the inlay. I also noticed much later that the inlay that I left on the inside of the back, where it connects to the skirt, is far too much, or it's much more than it needs to be. It only needs to be about 1 inch. I make a loose baste down the middle to hold the linen onto the cloth. The Holland linen goes onto the tails on tailcoats and morning coats, basically all body coats with this type of back with a brick tack and patrol seams. Only after the linen is added can the center back seam be actually machine sewn, because the linen should be sewn into the seam, but I get back to sewing the back seam later. As indicated, I want to reduce the armhole of the sleeve by reducing the crown, and I had pinned that out. At the apex of the crown, I marked down a good centimeter or half an inch, and used the other sleeve to indicate a run that I could copy to cut along. It had to start and end in the same place as it already does, with the first crown cut in 2 parts. The first sleeve can be placed onto the second sleeve, and the new edge followed for the second. After lengthening the sleeve, because I thought it was too short, that's it. That is the last I have recorded of the sleeve until it comes to sewing it in. Though again, since I didn't change the patrol seams of the back, and there's a drop right, this right sleeve would theoretically have to be altered some way in order to match the seams. First thing to fix is the seam that is not at all convex yet. Looking back, I think it may have been better to lower the front and back, and lengthen the tails the same amount, instead of just lowering the front. Last potential change that may have helped the vent sit closed a bit more is to shift the top of the seam slightly towards the front. It may have helped to push the vent closed. Also, given my lack of experience in the matter, it should have been rebasted to verify that my alterations worked. So overall, I think I got very lucky here. As mentioned, the tails of tailcoats are canvassed with a layer of body canvas, which is darted in the same place as it is on the cloth. Making this one with silesia is much closer to morning coats, taking a piece of silesia to cover from a little bit inside of the dart and the whole length of the tails. Basting a little across the top so that it doesn't flap around too much. Basting it down the length, I make the baste 1 seam allowance inside of the mark stitches, where the tails get folded over. This shows me where to sew the tails down onto the back, and it helps the silesia to remain in the fold as it's being made. it would be similar if it was canvas. It would keep the canvas inside of the fold as it's being made. Ideally, the line I was sewing along would have been chalked, but I did it by eye and it seemed to work out nicely. The excess silesia poking past the cloth can be cut away. Since it's being finished, the front edge going towards the hem can be cut down to only the inlay that you want for folding it over to finish it. If you are canvassing the front, then it would be cut down to a little the canvas would be cut down to a little behind the front edge, like canvas on the forepart. It would then be edge taped, which it will have to be taped anyway. Unbasting and uncanvassing the fronts, I need to undo the bottoms of the darts for the specific way that I want to sew the tails onto the fronts. Pressing the darts flat, they need to be cut open up the middle, if not already, and I mark where the tails seam will be, which is a seam allowance above the bottom edge of the jacket. I'm cutting the front lining in one piece, which just means that I need to make sure there's enough lining in there to put an underarm pleat in there, as well as marking the front dart, plus the pleat across the shoulder. Though, if you are quilting the lining under the arm, then it wouldn't have a dart, it would just be quilted. The back lining should be cut with a little extra past the neck and shoulder, and straight along the edge of the armhole and patrol seam. The balance point on the patrol seam should be marked so that it can be matched onto the back side body most accurately. The centre back seam and waist point can be marked on for reference. The lining should only be cut to a little below the hem as it's marked on. The back below the hem will be lined separately. The back should ideally be basted, and a pleat can be marked down the back until it gets to the waist point, as is a universal feature in jackets. The bottom of the back, the tails, and the back side body both need to be cut. The back side body is cut as the back side body, perhaps with a small amount of extra size. The tails, or skirts if you will, should be cut with a small amount of inlay along the top edge. Slightly wider at the top as well, tapering to match at the bottom. Here I hadn't cut down the front inlay to about a seam allowance yet, which would have been more economical for cutting the lining. To cover down the back, it just needs lining cut to about the same size as the length and breadth of the back, barely up to the waist, at least a little past the hem so that it goes above the brick tack. I want to mark the wrong sides on the linings so that I can put them to one side as I put the four parts together. Here, I base the lining side seam that would be done ahead of felling the backside body onto the front jacket. This was a mistake, and I should not have done so. Just sewn it nearly straight onto back by machine in basically the same way as the side body will go onto the back. I realise the mistake and remove it later though. On the other hand, I am sewing the side seam, sewing the backside body to the forepart, essentially. Starting with basting it and then machining it, there's nothing at all complicated about it. There aren't any side bends, like most jackets, so it's a simple stitch done in much the same way as normal side seams, but easier and shorter. One potential point of interest is that there may be two possible orders for making tailcoats. First is this, where the side seam is sewn before the patrol seams. The tails get sewn onto the front, and then the back gets sewn onto the front as well. Or the patrol seams are sewn, completing the back before the side seam. Then the side seams are sewn and the tails are added. This may cause more problems with adding the facing, specifically when making morning coats. With tailcoats it might work easily either way, but here I add the back side body to the front, then the tails, then join the back on to complete the jacket. While I'm going to the machine anyway, I sew the dart into the lining and machine sew the centre back seam in the lining and the cloth. On the back lining, the stitch can go straight down off of the lining without tacking it. On the cloth, the centre back seam just needs to be marked down the linen since it's covering the seam I would be using. It needs to be marked down to the hem where the brick tack will go to be back tacked onto that point to properly make said brick tack. On the back lining, I just want to pinking shear the lining along the fold so that there isn't an excessive amount of inlay. Press the centre back seam open, only down to the point that the stitch finishes. The brick tack always goes onto the right hand side of the back, so the left hand side inlay goes on top of the right hand side. Therefore, I mark a horizontal line onto the right hand side back. From the inside, I want to make a diagonal line on the left hand side inlay to the end of the machine stitch. I also press the edge over by a seam, which is about 6 centimeters or 2 3/8 of an inch from the mark stitches. You could cut down the diagonal line to the stitching, but before I do, I am making another horizontal line from the point that the stitching finishes. From there, I add about a seam allowance above it that intersects the diagonal line, which are the lines I then cut along. This releases the left-hand side inlay to be placed on top of the right-hand side. The right needs to be placed flat and pressed appropriately. I also fold the seam allowance over all the way up inside, which I find later to be unnecessary unless it was being hand-stitched. With the left on top of the right, the top edge of the tack can be pressed down now, along the horizontal lines that were chalked at the stitching. Since the right-hand side inlay is laying flat now and the centre back is pressed open, the inlay needs to be somewhat stretched and pressed into place. Laying it wrong side up, I snip into the centre back inlay and ensure that the seam is still pressed open practically down to the stitching. Only the inlay folding progressively further from the bottom until it's flat and pressing it down firmly. Essentially, the edge of the vent needs to be somewhere inside of the mark stitches going down the tail, either being folded under, cut, or cut down slightly and folded. This is why it could be unnecessary to have any more inlay than the width of the bottom of the back plus a seam, but in the event you had to let the back out in the base through the centre back, then you would need more of the tail inlay in order to keep the width of the brick tack the same. I add the back lining here only down the centre back because I realised that I wanted to add the back side body lining here first. I don't base much lower than the waist because I want the lining free for making up the brick tack and lining that area. On the forepart, I am underpressing and pressing the side seam open. keeping the dart pressed flat and unpicking some of the stitching. Lastly, chalking the front edge onto it for easier reference later. The tails are initially basted onto it the same way as in the base, lining up the dart to the side seam and the raw edges to the mark stitches. For my method, it is important that the opposite side of the dart doesn't get caught in the stitch, stitching all the way across. Theoretically, I should have lowered the mark stitches on the front and shortened the tails from the top, because the bottom edge of the jacket is now much lower than the seam that the tail is being sewn along. As it is, I do like this exaggerated dart seam. I need to cut the inlay down where the tails are sewn to, just to 5 centimeters or 2 inches. I take both of those to the machine and sew the seam. Remove the baste and press the seam open. Fold the forepart over the dart again. I baste the forward side of the dart down to the inlay that was just pressed up and to the front edge of the tails. It must only be machined to the bottom edge of the jacket, so that it can be pressed up and finished after the facing goes on. Last thing I need to do that really could have been done earlier is tape the front edge of the tails. Fusible or edge tape can be used, but I use linen tape here. If the tails were canvas like they're supposed to, then they should be fully edge taped already. It would have been ideal to take the edges and trim them before sewing them on in the first place though. To tape the edges, since it's a non-fusible tape anyway, I start from one side and baste along the mark stitches. It should be a slightly smaller base to firmly hold the tape into the edge, and the tape should be under slight tension, drawing in the edge of the tails. Drawing in the edge allows them to hug the leg better in the modest way you'd expect from a tailcoat, or potentially a morning coat. And at this stage, I really should have cut the edge down to about a seam allowance instead of leaving all of this inlay, which would make it a bit more difficult to finish as it is. After the finish, the inlay can serve no purpose, even if it is left there. I have the stitch that I want to make on the dart chalked on. The bottom edge of the jacket is also marked to be tacked. The stitch just runs from where the dart is already sewn. The dart can be pressed open, which presses the top of the tails over the tapes, as will be done as it gets close to finishing. Sewing the tails into the darts was the reason that I had to remove the canvas from the jacket. If the tails were just being sewn along the bottom edge of the jacket, then the canvas could have stayed. Putting the canvas back on, this time going all the way to finishing the front edge and padding the lapel. Given the particular circumstances of this tailcoat, I decided that I needed to add a shoulder pad. A thin pad, but it helps keep the shoulder very straight and clean. Especially with the much lighter canvas, it will keenly follow the bony contour of my shoulders. Furthermore, to account for the addition of the shoulder pad, I had to square the shoulders a bit. Coincidentally enough, I found later that the pattern seemed to be too square anyway. I don't necessarily square the shoulders enough for the pads, but it works out just about. With the shoulder alteration chalked on, I do a running stitch here as well, so that I don't lose the line. The shoulder pad lined up with the shoulder line fastened to the canvas. Adding the bridle and chalking out the lapel and edge ahead of padding the lapel and cutting and making the facing. Pressing the back inlays flat again, I'm lining the bottoms of the back. Since I want to machine these down rather than stitch them on, it needs to be flat to be machined. Otherwise it would be folded and basted, and then the lining folded and basted on top of it ahead of being felled at the finishing. The lining is placed onto the inlay on the insides where the cloth was on the fold, not on the outside where it will be attached to the tails. I am making a machine stitch, just a normal seam allowance all along the edge. It should not be back tacked because I may need to remove some of the stitching to properly fold the lining into place. I'm pinning the lining onto the seam, but the lining needs to have a small amount of ease along it, which is just so that it definitely is not tight when it's sewn. This is potentially similar when fully hand sewing the lining, but it's not difficult at all here. To add the pockets, I have some silesia cut about 45 centimeters or 18 inches deep, 20 centimeters or 8 inches wide at the top, and about as wide as I could get it at that depth of the tails. They're cut on the fold, and since I want the pockets for holding cutlery, I am adding an insert that will hold them up, similarly to how a coin pocket might be added in trousers. Essentially, to make them, I need to close the slanted edge and leave the top edge and the straight edge open, or at least most of the straight edge open, the top of the straight edge only. It doesn't have to be cut on the fold, but then if not, then the bottom has to be closed too. It is easy to see as the lining is laid open that there is some extra length in the lining, which just means that the tails down the back aren't being held tight at all. Pressing the lining down and then folding the back inlay over so that the cloth overhangs a small amount. The lining should not show past this edge. On the left-hand side where the brick tack is, the lining could be cut down slightly above where the tack will be in order to fold it underneath itself. This way the tack is practically lined as well before it gets sewn down, thoroughly pressing the tack and the lining to help them remain flat. The right-hand side lining also has to be folded and pressed over. In this particular case, the back lining is basted slightly too low and the bottom lining here is a little too long at the top. I cut some of the basting holding the back lining so that I can lay the bottom lining flat underneath the back. I also cut down the bottom lining a small amount at the top. I need to mark where the brick tack is so that I know where the stitching will go and by extension how much the back lining needs to cover. Folding and pressing the back lining into a point that covers the inside of the tack. It should be a point, or I don't know, could be a point, I've seen it without, but a point makes it easier to join it up to the lining on the side, on the body, and to position the hem. Moving the back lining out of the way, I basted the tack down now that it's fully lined. It's important to very firmly baste it in place in order to sew it down properly afterwards. The top edge of the brick tack could be machined down and slightly finished by hand, or totally prick stitched as I do here. In the future, I would machine it as my tailcoat from the 50s is. I measure the width of the tack from the centre back and measure that to the other side to make the stitching symmetrical, marking another line below that one for a second line of stitches to reinforce the top of the vent. Since the lining is folded over, I just want to baste it down the middle so that it's not completely free to flap around. It can't be sewn too close to the other inlays because it needs to be moved out of the way in order to sew the tails to it. The stitch also shouldn't be too close to the hem, so that the hem and the lining can be folded up to finish later. I need to cut the inlay on the lining down the back, continuing the patrol seams straight, so that the back side body can be sewn more easily, and refolding the point of the back lining slightly more neatly. It is much more easy to finish the tack before the patrol seams have been sewn, and somewhat only possible to machine it at this stage. Though, if it were being machined, I expect that that would just become part of the making process. Finally taking the backside body lining off of the forepart, I am lining the forepart. It's something that I just want to gloss over very quickly. Normally there is a layer or two of damet under the arm, sewn in one way or another. Some people quilt the damet on by machine or with prick stitches. Since I need this to be nice and light, I am not adding that. But curiously, my vintage tailcoat also doesn't have the quilting under the arm. Similar to the fitting, the patrol seams on the lining should theoretically be sewn from the balance points in the middle, making a small firm base to hold them together as they are being sewn. Given it's quite well basted, the stitch can be sewn from one side or the other instead of just from the balance points. In order to press the seams, I've found that I only think it actually works to press it with the back side bodies seam flat and the back lining folded under itself. This makes it a bit more difficult to fold, baste, and fell together, so I find it best to machine these seams. That being said, in one I have seen recently, the backside body lining is completely felled to, well, the other lining. I also have the seam allowances on the side seam ironed over already to make it slightly easier to sew the side seam lining. The patrol seams of the jacket can be sewn next. Like 3 times before, the seam gets basted together in the same way, starting with the balance points. Beforehand, I would like to mark the seam allowance, that is, the inlay around the waist area, from the back of the hem. Since my patrol seams are straight at the waist, not being suppressed at all, it continues from the edge above the inlay to 1 cm or 3/8 from the mark stitches going down the back inlay. Oddly enough, I don't actually mark these onto the correct sides where they would be useful. Very importantly, move the lining on the tails out of the way so that it doesn't get caught in any of the stitching that is about to be sewn. Positioning the forepart on the back, I start with the straight edges and place the bottom of the back side body 1 cm or 3/8 from the mark stitching that goes down the back. The hem inlay that's been folded up is obscuring the raw edge of the side body. Therefore, I chalk the seam that I want to baste and sew along. Again, since my seam is straight, I chalk a straight line from the raw edge above the inlay to 1 cm or 3/8 from the raw edge where it's sewn to the tails. This is the same point as the basting stitches which hold the sleisha to the tails, supposing those were done correctly as well. At the base again, it's important the top of the tails are positioned properly. As I alluded to when making up the tails for the fitting, it will be easier here. Using the baste that was used to hold the sleisha on, I can place the basting stitches against the mark stitches going down the back. I can then baste through the sleisha along the line of the aforementioned basting thread. At the base of the back side body, before beginning to sew the tails to the back seam, the seam should be opened and it should be checked that the balance points at the waist and the back both match. If they don't, then all of the stitching would have to be removed in order to fix it. Otherwise, continuing the base to the bottom of the tails. They don't necessarily have to be sewn all the way to the bottom of the inlay, but it can be just as easily removed afterwards. All the way down, I stay on the line of basting that's holding the sleecher there, and positioning the baste onto the mark stitches. Especially at the top of the tails, because it's curved, it has to be manoeuvred to match the mark stitches. The other side towards the armhole gets basted next. I finally chalk the seam on over the inlay around the hem and waist on the correct side. I'll say again, this is my first tailcoat. Manipulating the raw edge of the seams together, just taking care that the back isn't eased in or even stretched onto the back. Shifting the lining out of the way, which is why it couldn't be basted on or near the mark stitching going down the outside of the back. Placing the top of the tails at the seam with the back of the side body against the seam allowance that I did mark on this time. Then chalking the seam to baste across the inlay to make it a little easier. Much the same down the tail, putting the basting stitch against the mark stitches and making another basting stitch through the back along that same original stitch. It's important to at least do a final check that the balance points line up before the seams are finished. I've been told that the best bodycoats are made with the patrol seams basted, each from the balance points on the curve. Then they are backstitched with a silk finishing thread in a similar way. 2 stitches both starting from the balance point on the curve. I imagine it's a case of control, being able to feel all the way along the seam, where a machine might push or pull the cloth out of position. Though, worth to note that these methods are based on the apparatus available at the time. Apparatus having improved a lot since that time. Therefore, many years later, it can be unnecessary to hand stitch this seam, which is just a seam along a curve. Anyway, I hand stitched this seam in the traditional way, using a short back stitch like that would be used to sew the shoulders and armholes. The stitch needs to be pulled quite firmly so that the 2 pieces aren't falling apart from each other, but it can't be pulled tight such that the stitches are crushing the cloth between them and practically shortening the seam. Overall, it's unnecessary to hand stitch this seam, but I wanted to make a tailcoat that derives heavily from my tailcoat. Also, I wanted to make it such that it alludes to what might have been made in the 80s. Same reason the trousers have a button fly. That's the 1880s. Importantly, with the stitch is that it has to finish at the seam between the side body and the tail. A separate stitch is used to sew the tails down. The stitch can be sewn slightly onto the tails, but not too far. While I'm at this point, I want to clean up the basting, removing some of the stitches that's holding the patrol seams. Also very important to do is cut the stitching along the hem between the side body and the tails down to the stitch that was just sewn. Once the patrol seams are fully sewn, I can remove the basting ahead of sewing the tails to the back. Interestingly, it can be quite easy to tell the difference between a hand-stitched seam or machine-sewn seam. With a back-stitched seam sewn by hand, the threads are more diagonal between the two edges as you pull them apart and look at it. A lock-stitched seam sewn by machine, the threads will be perfectly perpendicular to the cloth. For clarity, I will chalk on the stitch that I will machine down in order to create the pleat going down the back. Lining still out of the way, the stitch should be 1/4 of an inch from the baste that I sewed to hold the layers together. This can be measured as a little more than 1/2 centimeter or up to 3/8 or 1 centimeter. At the top of the tails by the hem seam, the stitch needs to be back-tacked. The stitch can just be sewn about a foot's width from the basting. With industrial machines, that is about 1/4 of an inch. I'll iterate again that the lining has to be kept out of the way and it shouldn't be sewn through. The other tail is going from the bottom of the back to the hem of the body, just using the width of the foot to place the stitching in place. I'll also mention now that once the machining is done, the baste should be left there until the jacket is finished and the mark stitching is removed. This keeps the pleat closed in place so that it can be pressed properly. Again, at the hem of the jacket, the top of the tails have to be back-tacked. The seam allowance of the back side body cannot be caught in the seam so that it can properly be pressed open. Initially, anyway. If this were made properly, then the baste would be keeping the canvas into the fold, but it works the same way with a morning coat and other body coats. It keeps the silesia there instead. Unfortunately, I do not have film of pressing the patrol seams open. The seams do have to be pressed open though. It's easy with a typical wool cloth because either side of the curve of the seam stretches and shrinks appropriately. With the seams firmly pressed open though, the inlay going down the back needs to be unfolded to lay flat, which folds the tails along the baste, still holding them there. The seam allowance on the back then needs to gradually be pressed open as it goes up the seams, not unlike the center back seam when I was making the brick tack. This is easier though since there's less cloth. There is an inlay, there's just a seam allowance. With the backs flat again and the tails folded over, those then need to be underpressed to make the crease of the pleats. While I have the jacket flat here, underpressing the whole thing from the outside to cement the seams better to keep them flat. Bringing the tails pockets back, I have also sewn the bottom 12 centimeters or 5 inches of the straight edge closed, placing it against the machine stitch and the top edge at least a centimeter or so above the seam allowance. Basting it down from the inside of the pocket, across the top and down the opening. Cut the back lining across in line with the opening of the front of the pocket so that the cut is exactly where the cloth is. The lining can be moved on top of the inside of the pocket, and the raw edge then needs to be folded under itself and basted down. The lining below the opening is just released on top of the whole pocket. The opening of the pocket on top also needs a seam folded over so that it can be cleanly sewn to the lining of the tails. As far as I know, or rather don't know, is how exactly to put the pockets into the tails. I can't say for sure if there are known methods or whether there is a known method, but I've seen a few body coats and as many methods of putting the pockets in. I saw one recently that was so much simpler and better than mine. At the time, though, I just had to figure out a way of doing it, and it worked well enough. In some ways, that is most of this tailcoat, just figuring out ways of doing it, and it seems to work well enough. If you can think of an alternative way that, especially if you think it's better, then there is really no reason you can't use that, and the same goes for, well, an awful lot of everything, to be honest. Since the corner of the pocket goes past the edge of the tail, I just cut off the out of balance part. In hindsight, I should have folded away or sewn that corner in a rotund curve. I take a moment to press the edge of the tail into position, but I need to first start finishing the pockets. The lining needs to be filled onto the silicea. It needs to be done now because after the pocket is sewn down, I can't get into the pocket to sew the lining in place. The top of the pocket needs to be fastened, fold up the outside of the pocket, and then the silicea needs to be sewn down to the seam allowance and inlay of the body of the jacket, and possibly the seam allowance of the tails. This needs to be a firm lock stitch because this is all that I have holding the pocket up. In normal tailcoats with the canvas tails, there can be more stitches to hold the pocket in place. As it is, this is all I've got. I feel like it should go without saying, but the stitches that are finishing the pocket and that will be holding it up should not be visible from the outside of the jacket. Beginning to finish the edge and hem of the tails, I am finally trimming the inlay past the edge of the tails down to a more manageable amount, cutting off some of the inlay going down the back to make it a lot easier to fold away, reducing the layers. I'll say for the last time that me trying to make this more sharp at the base of the tail has not helped me here. All I'm doing is folding and basting along the edge of the tails and the hem of the back. Quickly to apply the lining to the tails, I will put the lining of the body on top of the tails lining. I'm initially placing it just so that it comfortably covers the whole tail and can be covered by the lining of the body. Starting with a loose baste towards the back of the tails, the lining needs to have some length eased in between each stitch so that the lining doesn't tighten the cloth, but it cannot have too much excess, otherwise over time it might begin to droop and fall past the edge of the tails to become unsightly and incorrect. Second baste I want to make under the side seam and make a small pleat in the lining at the hem of the body to account for the dart in the cloth. Third stitch is similar. Folding the lining over the back, I need it to cover the pocket opening, but not by much. Fastening the top of the lining through everything, then basting the folded edges together until getting to the base of the pocket opening, and then just basting the tails lining to the lining down the back. Finish the stitch a small amount above the hem of the back so that the lining along the edge can be folded up as well. There's no benefit to having the excess lining along the front, so I cut it down to a more manageable amount as well, to baste it down to the edge as well. Last thing to do then is baste the body of the lining up under itself onto the tails lining. That is really all the tailcoat specific making. It's just the shoulders, sleeves, and collar to add. I do decide to hand sew the sleeves and armhole seams, but that's not specific to tailcoats. With the tailcoat made and to be finished, that closes this part of making my Sebastian Michaelis tailcoat. In the next part I go over some of the tailcoat specific finishing, which should just be quite intuitive, as well as machining trouser braid onto trousers, and an idea about finishing trousers from a baste, speeding over the waistcoat with just some words on the laid-on lapel.